In 1852, deep within the red fields of Georgia, one man believed blood was a gift he could rearrange. To him, lineage was not sacred, it was a thing to be managed, shaped, and perfected by will alone. His name was Thomas Grier, and his plantation stood like a fortress between heaven and the grave. He believed the world was divided into two kinds of people, those born to serve, and those born to continue his name. Every life that breathed within his reach was a piece of a design only he could see. What began as pride grew into something colder, something that fed on silence and obedience. The walls of his house heard things the world outside never would, the sound of a man chasing immortality through his own blood. He watched his daughters grow not as children, but as reflections of his name, living vessels of his vision. And when he looked upon Eli, his most trusted vassal, he saw not a man, but strength, a body that could carry his will beyond its limits. In that place, where the soil was red and the air heavy with memory, Thomas Grier decided that legacy was not something to be left behind, it was something to be built by hand. He believed he could perfect his bloodline, cleanse it, mix it, make it endure. And so he began the quiet work of creation, not in scripture, not in science, but in flesh. The daughters did not speak of it. They knew that silence was the only language their father understood. The man who ruled them believed himself chosen, a maker of his own order, untouched by moral law. And as the years passed, the children born under his roof carried faces that told a truth no one dared to say aloud. It began with pride, but it did not end there. It became a legacy that blurred the boundaries between love and ownership, faith and madness, father and creator. It became a story of how one man's hunger for control remade generations who would never know his name, but would live forever in its shadow. This is the story of a man who thought he could rewrite creation. Georgia, 1852. A land draped in gold and sorrow. The field stretched wide, stitched together by rows of cotton and tobacco that shimmered under the sun like white fire. Every stalk, every bale, was born from hands that history refused to name. Life here followed a rhythm older than mercy, the whip, the hymn, the silence that settled after both. Plantations were kingdoms, and men like Thomas Grier ruled them as gods. Their words carried the weight of law, their moods determined the fate of families. To live under them was to breathe under watch, to move carefully through a world where a single glance could mean freedom or ruin. Honor, they said, was measured not by goodness, but by control, and Thomas had mastered that art. His estate stood at the edge of the Oconee River, a vast and ordered world carved from wilderness. Every face that worked his land bore the mark of exhaustion, yet none dared look beyond the horizon. In a time when blood defined worth, purity was worshipped like a creed. But behind the language of civility and scripture, cruelty hid in plain sight, polished, practiced, and praised. Among those bound to Thomas was a man named Eli. He was tall, with a quiet strength that unsettled those who watched him. His body carried the labor of 10 men, his silence the patience of 100 years. To the others, he was both feared and respected, a man who could endure anything and still rise before dawn to serve. To Thomas, he was more than a worker, he was a tool, a living vessel of strength, an answer to an unspoken idea that had begun to form in the master's mind. Eli's loyalty made him indispensable, but his presence carried a danger Thomas would not admit. Power recognizes power, even when it hides beneath chains. And in Eli, Thomas saw something he could use, something that might make his vision of a perfect bloodline more than a dream. In Georgia, the land itself seemed to breathe under the weight of hierarchy. Men were divided by race, women by obedience, and worth was determined by ownership. Yet beneath that order, cracks were forming, whispers of freedom spreading like smoke through the fields. But in the Grier plantation, there was no sound of rebellion, only the heavy quiet of control. For there, Thomas Grier had begun to imagine himself eternal, and every life around him, his daughters, his servants, even the unborn, were threads in a pattern only he believed he could weave. Thomas Grier's pride was not content with wealth or land. What he sought was permanence, the kind that outlives graves and carries a man's shadow through centuries. He began to speak less of God and more of design, claiming that the body was a canvas waiting for a steady hand. In his journals, scrawled in uneven ink, he wrote of perfection, of a line of flesh refined through careful choosing, through calculated joining. He believed the flesh could be improved, mixed, and corrected, not by divine will, but by his own. He studied his daughters as if they were part of a formula he alone understood. To neighbors, he was an eccentric man, too curious for his own good, yet they admired his poise, his education, his authority. Few dared question the strange notes he kept or the quiet shipments of medical books arriving from Savannah. Some said he read them by candlelight until dawn, tracing diagrams of human form beside sketches of family trees. He told those close to him that he intended to create strength that would never fade, a legacy that could not be diluted by time or impurity. The whispers began in town, quiet but persistent. Some believed he had gone mad with grief after his wife's death, others said he had touched something unholy, a pride that no man was meant to carry. But Thomas moved through their rumors with the calm of conviction. To him, there was no madness in it. There was only purpose. He watched Eli with growing fascination. In the vassal's endurance, in the shape of his muscles and the steadiness of his eyes, Thomas saw a blueprint. The man's strength was undeniable, his obedience precise, his silence absolute. Thomas convinced himself that in Eli's blood lay the vigor his own lineage lacked, a raw power that could be harnessed, guided, and transformed. And so the thought rooted itself in him, a thought that would fester into obsession. He began to speak of the human body as though it were a crop that could be cultivated, tended, and made stronger with each generation. In his mind, his daughters became the vessels of this design. Eliza, the eldest, calm and dutiful; Catherine, proud and sharp-eyed; May, gentle, untouched by the hardness of her father's world. Each represented a different thread of his legacy, and each, he decided, would bear the weight of his creation. He withdrew further from the world, shutting himself in his study for days at a time, surrounded by the smell of ink and burning oil. His servants learned not to knock. His daughters learned not to ask. What he wrote there, the charts, the sketches, the notes of what he called refinement, would never leave those walls. But from that study came the first commands that would bind the family to a future no one could have imagined. Thomas Grier believed he had found a way to improve on God's work. And in doing so, he set in motion a legacy that would stain every generation born beneath his name. The house of Thomas Grier was quiet, but not with peace. It was the kind of silence that presses against the skin, a silence that listens. Within those walls lived his three daughters, Eliza, Catherine, and May, each carrying the same blood, yet bearing it differently. Eliza, the eldest, had her mother's steadiness. She moved through the house with the grace of someone who understood danger without ever naming it. Her faith was her armor. She prayed often, not for salvation, but for calm. To her father, she was the perfect daughter, obedient, devoted, the keeper of his order. When he spoke, she lowered her eyes. When he commanded, she obeyed. But beneath her stillness lived a quiet ache, a knowing that her loyalty had become her cage. Catherine, the second, was nothing like her sister. She saw too much, questioned too often. There was fire in her that her father could not control. She noticed the way he studied them, not as children, but as instruments. She read the letters he left on his desk, the ones filled with words like purity, strength, and continuation. And she began to understand that her father's affection was not love at all, but possession dressed in tenderness. Her defiance frightened him, and so he punished her with distance, the cruelest weapon he knew. May, the youngest, lived between their shadows. She was soft-spoken, gentle, still untouched by the full weight of her father's will. To her, he was not a monster, but a man broken by grief. She had been too young to remember their mother clearly, only the scent of her dress, the sound of her laughter that faded before memory took hold. Some said grief had driven Thomas into his delusion, others said it merely unmasked what was already there. Whatever the truth, May never learned to see him as the others did. Her innocence made her blind, and her blindness made her easy to shape. Each daughter grew beneath the shadow of their father's power, where love was measured by obedience and silence was the only proof of loyalty. They learned that to question him was to invite ruin, that to resist was to vanish from his favor. Meals were eaten in near silence, conversations reduced to nods and glances. The walls themselves seemed to listen, holding the weight of words never spoken. Their home became a place of quiet performance, daughters moving through their father's design, careful not to disturb the balance of his control. They lived not for themselves, but for the image he demanded of them. And though they shared the same blood, they were bound more tightly by fear than by affection. By the time the spring of 1852 passed into summer, the Greer daughters no longer spoke of hope. They had learned that within their father's house, even dreams could be dangerous. Eli lived between two worlds, one of obedience, the other of shame. His life had been shaped by orders, his worth measured in how much pain he could endure without protest. He had no choice, for his body was owned, and his strength was his curse. To Thomas Greer, Eli was not merely a man, he was function, utility, the living tool through which power could be reborn. In the early days, Eli believed his loyalty would protect him. He worked the fields with precision, his hands steady, his back unbroken. He was trusted to manage other men, to oversee the work that filled Greer's coffers. But trust in that house was not safety, it was a leash made of silence. The closer he was drawn to the master, the less of himself remained. It began with commands spoken softly, as if wrapped in civility. Thomas spoke of legacy, of a plan too grand for others to understand. He told Eli that his strength was divine, that it could serve a purpose greater than labor. Those words, heavy with deceit, pressed Eli into a duty he could not refuse. Thomas's design demanded participants, and Eli, bound by chains both seen and unseen, became the instrument of that design. When the orders came, Eli's world cracked. He was told he would serve the daughters, not as a man, but as proof of his master's theory. Thomas's voice carried no rage, no cruelty in tone, it was calm, measured, the voice of a man convinced that sin could be turned into science. Eli understood then that he had ceased to exist as himself. Every part of him, his body, his will, his dignity, had been taken and repurposed for another man's obsession. The nights that followed were heavy with silence. Within that house, duty became desecration. Eli's heart carried a storm he could never release, because every act forced upon him was both an order and a crime. He feared his own reflection. He feared the eyes of the women he was told to touch, women who bore the same chains though they lived in the master's blood. The line between victim and vessel vanished beneath the weight of obedience. As the months passed, the house filled with the sound of new life. Children born of power, silence, and confusion, faces that mirrored both master and servant, bound by a truth that could never be spoken aloud. Eli could not look upon them without shame, for they were the living proof of his bondage, the continuation of a legacy he had never chosen to create. He worked by day as he always had, his hands steady, his gaze lowered, but within him grew a quiet horror that would never leave. The master did not just breed them, he bred his own future. A future built on the broken bodies and silenced souls of those who had no voice left to resist. The Greer plantation had become a house of secrets. The air around it changed, heavier, watchful, filled with murmurs that died as soon as footsteps approached. Those who worked the fields began to notice things that could not be explained, though no one dared speak them aloud. Babies born beneath the Greer roof carried faces that unsettled even the boldest tongues, eyes that mirrored the master's, skin that carried the sun's hue. Each resemblance was a whisper made flesh. Servants who questioned too much were sent away, their absence never mentioned. Some were sold, others simply vanished, leaving behind only the echo of their warnings. Those who remained learned that silence was safer than truth. At night, prayers replaced conversation, whispered in corners, spoken into the dirt rather than the air, as though the wind itself could betray them. Neighbors noticed the change, though few acknowledged it directly. Guests who once filled the Greer dining hall began to decline invitations. They spoke, instead, in quiet drawing rooms and church pews, their words wrapped in politeness but laced with fear. There was talk of the master's peculiar studies, of lights burning late into the night, of children whose laughter carried an eerie familiarity. The Greer name, once spoken with respect, became something to avoid, a shadow that stretched beyond its fences. Inside the plantation, those who served learned the rhythm of discretion. They moved carefully through rooms, eyes downcast, hands trembling when they caught sight of the master's daughters, women who no longer smiled, whose faces had grown pale with resignation. The children they bore were kept from view, yet their cries filled the night, thin and echoing through the halls like confessions the house itself refused to hold. No one knew the full truth, but everyone knew enough to be afraid. Some called it sin, others madness, but most understood it for what it was: power gone unchecked, faith turned inward until it devoured itself. And so they kept their distance, tending their fields, minding their tongues, pretending not to see what stood so plainly before them. In a world where speaking truth meant death, silence became the only rebellion. Years slipped quietly through the Greer estate, each season leaving behind a heavier shadow than the last. The children born within those walls began to walk, speak, and laugh beneath the same sky that had once held their mother's silence. The fields echoed with the laughter of children who belonged to no world at all, too pale to be hidden among the enslaved, too dark to be acknowledged by the master's kind. They grew between two truths, accepted by neither, carried by both. Eli watched them from a distance, his heart torn by contradictions he could not escape. In their faces, he saw fragments of himself, the curve of a cheek, the shape of a hand, reminders of the life he was forced to create but could never claim. They were his blood, yet they did not know his name. Each time one ran past him, barefoot and smiling, the weight in his chest deepened. Pride and sorrow became indistinguishable. He had given them life, but that life was bound in chains invisible to them, forged by the will of another man. Thomas Greer, meanwhile, grew older and prouder, mistaking his moral decay for genius. He spoke of himself as a creator, convinced that his vision had succeeded where nature had faltered. To him, the children were proof of his power, evidence that his name would stretch across generations untouched by time or mortality. "My blood," he would say, "will outlast kings." The words rolled from his tongue like a sermon, each syllable fed by vanity and denial. He built a ledger of names, recording every birth with the precision of a man keeping count of his glory. He named the children after stars, Orion, Lyra, Cassiopeia, as though the heavens themselves would disguise their beginnings. Perhaps he thought the names would redeem him, or perhaps they were an attempt to forget that each child had been born in darkness, from acts that no prayer could cleanse. Eli's silence became his only language. He watched the master cradle those children as if they were trophies, while the daughters withdrew further into themselves, their eyes hollowed by years of quiet endurance. The house that once pulsed with ambition had turned into a shrine of contradiction, filled with laughter that carried sorrow, life born from ruin, pride that masqueraded as legacy. Outside, the land bloomed as it always had, the field stretching wide and endless. But within those walls, time had stopped. Every face, every breath, every child was part of the same design, a lineage shaped by control, sealed by silence, and bound forever to the man who believed he could outlive God. The quiet that had long shielded the Greer estate began to falter. Whispers that once lingered between servants and travelers made their way into church pews and town meetings. A local preacher, worn by years of caution, found himself unable to ignore what he had heard. In his Sunday sermon, he spoke in vague terms of sin that grows within the home, of pride that turns men against their maker. He never said the name Greer aloud, but every face in the congregation turned toward the same direction. Among the neighboring landowners, curiosity shifted into unease. They had long envied Thomas Greer's wealth, his control, his perfect order. But envy soured when they began to see the cracks beneath that perfection, the strange children hidden away, the daughters who no longer appeared in public, the servants who vanished after speaking too freely. Some called it corruption. Others whispered of curses. Rumors reached as far as Savannah, carried by merchants and visiting clergy. They spoke of a man who had broken the most sacred boundaries, who had built his own bloodline by defying nature itself. They called it the cursed Greer blood, a line unblessed by heaven, untouched by grace. The story spread quietly, passed from mouth to mouth like a secret too dangerous to name. The church in town sent word to the Greer estate, a private letter written with trembling restraint. Behind closed doors, they denounced Thomas as a man who had replaced faith with vanity, devotion with desecration. But when the letter was sent, no one dared deliver it in person. The men of the cloth knew what others feared to admit, that Thomas Greer's wealth had built their very walls, his donations filling their offering plates. Their outrage stopped where his money began. In the taverns and back rooms of Georgia, his name became a warning. Yet still, no one confronted him. They spoke only in half-truths and nervous tones, careful to keep their accusations from reaching his ear. It was safer to pretend they knew nothing than to risk the wrath of a man who owned too much and answered to no one. Sin had many forms, but this was blasphemy. And still, they let it breathe, let it grow, because their fear was stronger than their faith. They feared the man, not the monster he had become. May's labor lasted longer than any had anticipated. The house, already heavy with years of silence, grew still in a way that pressed against the walls themselves. When she died, the air seemed to crack with the weight of inevitability. Her passing was not just a loss, but a rupture, a reminder that even obedience cannot conquer death. The children she carried, and those who had come before, were left behind, fragile witnesses to a legacy too vast for one life to hold. Eli, already worn by years of servitude, reached a breaking point. When Thomas demanded he continue his role in the master's designs, something inside him snapped. He refused. For the first time, he met Thomas not with submission, but with silence that carried the weight of rebellion. The master's fury came swift and unrestrained. He struck Eli, not only in anger but in disbelief that his will could be denied. The sound of that blow echoed through halls that had known only quiet obedience, awakening a tension that could no longer be contained. That night, fire consumed the Greer mansion. Flames licked the ceilings, swallowed staircases, and twisted the furniture into unrecognizable shapes. Some whispered that Eli had finally acted, that his body, long forced into the role of instrument, had finally chosen a single act of defiance. Others claimed the house itself rejected its sins, that the structure could no longer hold the weight of what had been done within its walls. Either way, nothing survived intact. When the flames died, the master's empire was reduced to ash and ruin. Wealth, pride, and control, all that Thomas Greer had built, had been swallowed in an instant. Yet in the charred remains, a legacy persisted. The children, hidden or forgotten, survived the fire, and Eli's ashes bore silent testimony to the horrors endured within those walls. Where once stood a dynasty of greed and obsession, now lay only remnants of flesh and memory. His bloodline endured, scattered and unclaimed, waiting to grow in a world that had yet to understand the full weight of what had occurred. The surviving children were scattered, placed with neighboring families who claimed them as wards or distant kin. They were given new names, new histories, and a life that tried to erase the horrors of their birth. Some grew fair, others dark, their features a patchwork of the master and the vassal, yet all carried the same ghost within them, a memory they could not name, a presence that lingered in the curve of a smile or the tilt of an eye. They learned to live quietly, each step measured against the shadows of what had been. No one spoke of the Greer house, no one asked where their parents had gone, and no one dared hint at the legacy etched into their very bones. Even as they married, as they bore children, the truth remained hidden, unacknowledged but persistent. Decades passed, and the hidden bloodline wove itself quietly through Georgia. Descendants met and married without knowing their connection, unaware that the same currents of secrecy and power flowed through their veins. What Thomas Greer had begun in obsession, Eli had endured in silence, and the daughters had survived in fear, continued in ways neither he nor they could have foreseen. By the time the Civil War came, the Greer name was gone, erased from town records and social registers. But his seed had already spread across Georgia, carried in blood that remembered what the tongue could not speak. Families who thought themselves separate bore the same legacy, the same quiet inheritance of a house that no longer existed, yet whose influence had become invisible, permanent, and unstoppable. He thought he was creating a dynasty. What he created was a curse. The fields he once commanded lie empty now, the house long turned to ash, yet the echo of his ambition persists in ways he could never have measured. Graves scatter across quiet soil, marked by names that mean nothing to the descendants who walk above them. Trees stretch their limbs over lands that remember in shadow what memory cannot hold. Faces, weathered by time and distance, carry traces of a story never told, an inheritance they will never understand. Blood remembers what the tongue forgets. It travels silently, threading through generations, shaping lives without explanation, carrying the weight of choices made decades before. Each child, each descendant, unknowingly continues the line that began with obsession and control, a secret woven into the fabric of existence itself. Some say the Greer blood still runs through Georgia, unseen, unspoken, eternal. It is a legacy that cannot be recorded, cannot be corrected, and cannot be denied. If you believe history hides its darkest stories in the blood, subscribe for more truths buried in time.